True Murder.
It's a rare insight into a killer's tortured mind.
The most shocking killers in true crime history.
Victims were brutalized, shot, stabbed.
And the authors that have written about them.
Bundy, Dahmer.
I would also play with Yash, like if you play with sand.
The Night Stalker. BTK. Every week, another fascinating author talking about the most shocking and infamous killers in true crime history. True Murder, with your host, journalist and author,
Dan Zupansky.
Good evening. By the late 1970s, the fishermen of the Texas Gulf Coast were struggling. The bays that had sustained generations of shrimpers and crabbers before them were being poisoned by nearby petrochemical plants, oil spills, pesticides, and concrete. But as their nets came up light, the white shrimpers could only see one culprit, the small but growing number of newly resettled Vietnamese refugees who had recently started fishing. Turf was claimed, guns were flashed, threats were made. After a white crabber was killed by a young Vietnamese refugee in self-defense, the situation became a tinderbox primed to explode, and the Grand Dragon of the Texas Knights of the Ku Klux Klan saw an opportunity to stoke the fishermen's rage and prejudices. At a massive Klan rally near Galveston Bay one night in 1981, he strode over to an old boat graffitied with the words USS Viet Cong, torch in hand, and issued a 90-day deadline for the refugees to leave or else. It's going to be a hell of a lot more violent than Vietnam. The white fishermen roared as the boat burned, convinced that they could drive these newcomers from the coast. Everything would return to normal. A shocking campaign of violence ensued, marked by burning crosses, conspiracy theories, death threats, torch boats, and heavily armed Klansmen patrolling Galveston Bay. The Vietnamese were on the brink of fleeing until a charismatic leader in their community, highly decorated colonel, convinced them to stand their ground by entrusting their fate with the Constitution. Drawing upon a trove of never-before-published material, including FBI and ATF records, unprecedented access to case files, and scores of first-hand interviews with Klansmen, shrimpers, law enforcement, environmental activists, lawyers, perpetrators, and victims, Johnson uncovers secrets and secures confessions to crimes that went unsolved for more than 40 years. This explosive investigation of a forgotten story, years in the making, ultimately leads Johnson to the doorstep of the one woman who could see clearly enough to recognize the true threats to the bay, and who now represents the fishermen's last hope. The book that we're featuring this evening is The Fisherman and the Dragon, Fear, Greed, and a Fight for Justice on the Gulf Coast, with my special guest, journalist and author, Kirk Wallace Johnson. Welcome to the program, and thank you so much for this interview, Kirk Wallace Johnson.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, and congratulations on this, as I mentioned, very unique and extraordinary book.
Yeah, I'm quite happy to see it finally coming out. This was a years-long and grueling process to get it to this point.
Absolutely. As you do in the very first chapter, you introduce this main character, one of the main characters, Billy Joe Applin, his wife Judy and his daughter Beth, and they have Billy Joe Jr. and Cheryl Ann, 4-year-old. And they are shrimpers. Actually, they're working being crabbers. So let's talk about Billy Joe Applin and his family and when they got to this area, introduce these people and what he found one day regarding crabs.
Sure. So Billy Joe, I believe, was born in Florida, although his family moved back and forth along the Gulf Coast as fishermen. But by the time that the events of the story began, he was working as a crabber in a little town called Seadrift, Texas, population, 900 or so. He had a kind of string of bad luck where he had started out as a crabber, but then saved up enough money to buy a shrimp boat, which is much more profitable. But the day that he was set to make his last payment to the bank on that boat, his net snagged something in the bottom of one of the bays and sank and sort of knocked him back down to crabbing. As he said, he had 4 kids. This was, hard scrabble existence, sort of chasing the catch. But he, has a kind of daily routine of going out. It's called running your traps, but going and rebaiting the traps, pulling up the crab. And he's out one day with his family and He pulls up at one of the traps and finds a severely mutated crab. The shell is all misshapen. And, this was happening more and more in the 70s, late 60s and the 70s along the Texas coast. People were pulling up mutated shrimp and seeing strange things like dolphin die-offs and, zombie-like fish and alligators rolling in circles near the surface. And to Billy Joe, he saw one real culprit behind all of this, which came in the form of these petrochemical plants that were lining almost all of the Texas bays, and which had been kind of metastasizing for decades ever since oil had been discovered there.
You also introduce a woman named Diane Wilson that notices the same things. Her family has been there since, as you write, since the 1890s, involved crabbing and shrimping, involved in the business in one way or another. And she notices some of the same sorts of mutants and freak fish that
Billy Joe did.
Yes, as well. Yes.
Yeah. And in a similar vein, she suspected the plants, but she didn't really know what to do. She was a young mother. She had 5 kids, but she just on a hunch started storing these specimens in a freezer at the fish house. But, there was a real immediate roadblock, which was that most of these plants, which are, they're oil refinery, they're plastic, they're chemical production plants, most of them hired these same shrimpers and crabbers in the off season. Nearly every one of these people had family members that worked at these plants. And so, when Billy Joe pulled up that mutated one, he was pissed off, and he sat down and wrote this letter to his fellow fishermen saying, we got to fight these plants. We got to stop them from dumping this stuff in the bays. It's going to kill off our way of life. But that appeal, that kind of call to arms went nowhere. Nobody joined his fight. And, he basically resigned himself to just feeling somewhat impotent, I think, in the face of these huge plants.
What were the companies that were there, that were established there, and what kind of permissions and advantages were they promised for relocating to that area?
So, some of the more familiar ones like Exxon and Dow, but also companies like Formosa and Union Carbide. These were plants that, I think at the time the events of the book, over half of all chemicals in the United States were produced just around Galveston Bay in Texas, to say nothing of further down the coast. Nearly half of the entire oil industry was centered there. They were doing industrial chemicals, but also, making everything from plastic bags to milk jugs to ingots for production elsewhere. And so in order to build these plants, though, these companies had been enticed by the Texas bigwigs, senators and governors and others, to come pick Texas as the site for their plant. It was usually Texas fighting against Louisiana. And in exchange, if these big industries chose Texas, they would get tax abatements. The local school districts would forego, taxes, county taxes. They would get breaks. But also, the state started impounding fresh water from the rivers that traditionally fed these bays for thousands of years, and then giving that water to the plants to use in their operations. And then on the other end of it, giving them discharge permits to then dump that water, which is now chock full of all of this toxic stuff, into the bays where the crab and the shrimp grow. So really this is a seismic fundamental reordering of like what the bays were being used for. And those plants did everything they could to ingratiate themselves with the local community. So they would, they'd give the local police force like an early computer system, or they, new chairs for schools and new school books and things like that.
You also talk about other factors that were affecting the shrimp business and just the seafood business, period, at that time. But you talk about environmental causes, but also Union Carbide and farm fishing in India.
Yeah. It's fascinating and kind of crazy story of the way the world turns, I guess. But, for so long, people couldn't figure out how to farm shrimp. It was just too delicate a process, and they couldn't figure out like the aeration and the right food to give them until, in this case, it was a government lab in Galveston Bay that figured it out like in the 60s. And couple things happened. That a lot of the plants, which had, a lot of real estate on the bays, they started opening up shrimp farms, not just in the US, but around the world. But also my old employer, USAID, in the 70s sent mariculturalists, these experts from Galveston Bay all over Southeast Asia, to Vietnam, to Malaysia, to Indonesia, to teach them what's called the Galveston method of farming shrimp. And, within a decade, farm shrimp were becoming so huge on the global market that it kind of returned like a heat-seeking missile to Texas, because it suddenly became a hell of a lot cheaper for Americans to buy frozen breaded shrimp that was raised on a farm than wild-caught shrimp from the Gulf of Mexico. So there were a lot of like complicated but almost immovable forces that were, from one perspective, kind of dooming this way of life of fishing this coastline.
You also write about a major oil spill that will affect the marine life as well and drifts into the Galveston Bay as well.
Yeah, I mean, somebody Googles oil spills in the Gulf of Mexico, it seems like a never-ending set of results. But right around the time of the events of this book, there was a truly historic deep water well explosion down the coastline across the border in Mexico in the Bay of Campeche, the Ixoc spill, that it took a full 10 months for them to cap it. It was the largest peacetime oil spill in world history, that is until the BP spill in 2010. That one sent a slick the size of Manhattan into Texas water, where it oiled beaches and killed off aquatic life. But as you said, in Galveston Bay, there were also massive tanker collisions. Even in the process of reporting the book, I went down several times to go shrimping with some of the individuals at the heart of the story. And at some point, it started to seem like some joke, because every time I got on the plane, like that day, there would be some new explosion at a plant where a bunch of toxic chemicals seeped out into the bay, or there was another tanker collision, and there would be a die-off of the shrimp. So, this was quickly becoming the most polluted water in America.
Let's get back to June 29th, 1979, and Billy Joe Applin. And he's in a particular situation with his own economy. And with his crab traps, something happens that day. Can you tell us what happens and his reaction?
Sure. So, he's kind of fresh off his, I guess, defeat of failing to rally his fellow shrimpers against the plants.
Right.
When he's out with his family running his traps one morning, and he sees that a Vietnamese crabber by the name of Sao Van Nguyen had dropped his traps too close to Billy Joe's. Now, there's no law against this. This is what they call an unwritten rule of the bay. But Billy Joe just snapped. He yanked these traps up in front of Sao, smashed them, and threw them into the water and sped off. And Sao, who was all of 18 at that point, he sped off in search of some of his Vietnamese friends, including the one that had first invited him down to this little town to start crabbing. And the Vietnamese were frustrated because people had been smashing their traps or stealing them. And so they went out in 4 or 5 boats a couple hours later, and they confronted Billy Joe and his family. And it was not a benign confrontation. There were knives flashed. They were all shouting at each other. Billy Joe drew a knife of his own. And Billy Joe, sees his kids on this boat, terrified, and, basically rams his way out of this confrontation and gets back to shore, decides not to bring charges against the Vietnamese for this, what they had, said or done to him out there. But something kind of switched in him after that point. Every time he was in town, if he crossed paths with Sao, he would threaten to kill him. He raised his rifle at Sao at one point. On another occasion, he slashed Sao's tires. He threatened to kill him. And Sao, being worried for his safety, went to Walmart and got himself a pistol. I don't think he ever anticipated that he'd need to use it so quickly. But there was one night, almost exactly a month after that confrontation out on the water, where Sao and 2 of his brothers were down by the docks, and they were looking at a new skiff that he had just bought. And they were, excited to test out the engine and things. And Billy Joe comes screeching into the parking lot and starts shouting at Sal. And very quickly it becomes physical and he starts pummeling Sal. Billy Joe my understanding was he was around 6 foot, 6'1", but he had about 100 pounds and a full foot of height over Sal. And he, at one point, then draws a knife and slashes Sal across the chest. Sal jumps in his car and speeds back to the trailer park where the Vietnamese in town lived and gets his pistol. And he thinks about one of his brothers who's down by the docks, and he's worried that Billy Joe might go after his brother next. So he speeds back down to the docks, whereupon Billy Joe yanks him from the car and starts punching him more. But at this point, Sal draws his pistol. Billy Joe freezes, pleads for his life, and Sal shoots him dead. That killing honestly has ripple effects 40 years later because of what happened in the immediate aftermath. Sal raced back to the trailer park. A friend of his found him sitting on the hood of his car because he was about to turn himself in to the police, but they were worried that the local police force might have been infiltrated by a Klan, which might sound kind of fantastical, except it was well known back then that, there were photo series of Houston and Galveston police in uniform with hoods over their head doing night patrols. So Sal flees town and decides to turn himself in another town in Texas where nobody on the force might have heard of Billy Joe Applin. And there, but that night, a posse of white sea drifters and crabbers and shrimpers, angry over the killing of Billy Joe Applin, and, pretty liquored up, and some of them stoned, meet in this grove behind one of the town bars, and they fill up a bunch of empty liquor bottles with gas and make Molotov cocktails out of these things. And they went around town, set fire to a home where Vietnamese refugees were living, about 10 or 15 of them. And then they went down to the docks and started torching Vietnamese boats.
You talk about and introduce again this Diane Wilson, this shrimper from way back, her family. And it's so pervasive, the attitude towards these Vietnamese, that person that she grew up with had told her that he was partly responsible or was involved.
Yes, that's right. That's, someone she'd known forever walked into the home of one of her best friends soaking wet and announced that he had just torched some Vietnamese boats. In the subsequent weeks, she saw kids that she had, babysat riding around town with guns, pledging total war against the Vietnamese. And one thing you have to understand is that this is a tiny town where until a couple of years prior, not a single one of them had ever seen a Vietnamese person in town.
Right.
The only reason the Vietnamese were really there was because someone had opened up a crab picking plant, kind of hoping to capitalize on this growing love of seafood that was happening in large part because of Red Lobster. But they opened a plant to pick crabs, but they couldn't find any white people that were willing to do the work. And so it wasn't until they discovered that these would be willing to stand for 10 hours a day, getting their fingers all lacerated, pulling crab meat, that the Vietnamese started being invited into town. And so within a couple of years of that plant opening, the population went from about 900 to 1,100, but all of the newcomers were Vietnamese. They were all kind of sequestered to one trailer park in the corner of town that people referred to with all kinds of racist names. But the Vietnamese kept to themselves until and tried to kind of keep their heads down. But after the home was torched and their boats were torched, they all fled within a day or so, and there were virtually zero Vietnamese left in town. There was a curfew put in place, and there was a real concern that there was going to be more killing.
What happens with Sao and his brother that helped him? What happens? What's their fate? And what does that lead up to?
Well, the expectation was that this would be a swift trial, Texas justice, that these Sao and his brother, who was there at the time of the shooting and was believed to be an accomplice, that they were both going to be given the death penalty in Texas. Through a pretty extraordinary turn of events, they ended up with a very powerful and brilliant lawyer named Pat Maloney, who defended them in a very conservative town of Seguin, Texas, in front of an all-white jury. And I've read the voir dire of the jury selection, and there were plenty of white people that just emphatically said, I know we're supposed to presume, give the benefit of the doubt and innocent until proven guilty, but I'm not willing to do that for these Vietnamese. And so they get, spiked. But an all-white jury ultimately heard the facts, heard the testimony, and acquitted Sao and his brother on grounds of lawful self-defense.
Right.
Now, many people saw that as an inspiring thing, but in these little coastal towns, these fishing towns, they were outraged. They wanted Sao killed. And it kind of turned Billy Joe Applin into a martyr, overnight. And shortly after that, the Ku Klux Klan came to town pledging to do something like a fact-finding mission because they alleged some kind of government conspiracy and improprieties in the trial and things like that. So that's where the story really kind of lurches forward because now you've got Klansmen marching and threatening violence against the Vietnamese in some part because of the outcome of that trial.
You write about this B.T. Applin, the father of Billy Joe, and some of the remarks that he makes that are clearly in support of the Klan. And he says he's been a Klansman his whole life. So in terms of the Klan, you introduced this Louis Beam, Grand Dragon.
That's right. Yeah. And I mean, Louis he was already radicalized before he deployed, but he deployed to Vietnam as a door gunner, which is arguably the most harrowing role in that entire war, highest casualty rate. But he returns, highly decorated, but also when he sees the fall of Saigon is just enraged with his government. He feels that the government didn't let them really fight and that his government lost the war. And there's a certain amount of embarrassment and all of this. He gets a tattoo, Born to Lose, and, commits himself to this fight against his government, but also against these refugees who are coming. He becomes the Grand Dragon of the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan in Texas, and also builds up a militia that was training in secret locations throughout the state. He had active duty servicemen from Fort Hood. They were doing all kinds of training on, it's hard to imagine this or remember this from back then, but they were consumed with this belief that the United States had gotten so soft that the Soviets were about to invade at any point.
Right.
And that in part because of the integration of the military, but also the loss in Vietnam, that the U.S. military would be incapable to defend against the Soviets. And so it would fall upon the Klan and their militias to save America. And then they would take over at running the country. This was their worldview. This is how they spoke. And so he involves himself in this growing conflict between the white and Vietnamese fishermen. For decades, nobody really understood why he cared so much. It wasn't until I was able to sit down with Judy Applin, Billy Joe's widow, that she confessed that they themselves had joined the Klan a year prior to the killing. So that solves a big piece of that puzzle. He got involved because one of his own guys was killed. But something happened. The minute he started threatening to get the Klan involved in this conflict, he got national news coverage. He got, banks of TV crews, Walter Cronkite's team going out and filming anything he said about the white man and the government plot to replace them with immigrant labor. And every time he got on the news, he got new members joining the Klan, and those members paid dues that he needed to live off of. So, there's in some ways after the killing of Billy Joe, and he does this sort of big media blitz with this trip down there to investigate. It was all nonsense. He didn't investigate anything. But he got to open up a new Klan chapter in that town after that visit. And so I think that kind of set the model, or proved the model for him for his subsequent involvement about a year and a half later up in Galveston Bay when things got much more intense.
So tell us what happens as a result in this community. And there are some Vietnamese that you say that vast majority left, 120 of the 150. But people like Bang with his boat, Bang Cherry, are still in the community. What of them?
Yeah, it's remarkable because in this initial uptick, where they fled after the initial fire bombings, they in that little town of Seadrift, they eventually came back and just kept at it and kept working. But farther up the coast, in 1981 when all of this really boiled over. It's hard to imagine, but there were Klan rallies with 1,000 people, plenty of white shrimpers and crabbers and their allies, chanting white power, and where Louis Beam was giving the Vietnamese 90 days to get off that coast and to get out of this industry or else face blood, blood, blood. And a lot of the Vietnamese were planning on it. People were brandishing guns at them in town, giving them death threats, threatening to burn their boats. They then started burning boats. There was this insane Klan boat patrol where they went out heavily armed and robed into Galveston Bay with an effigy of a Vietnamese refugee hanging from one of the outriggers under a Confederate flag, just looking for Vietnamese to threaten. A lot of those Vietnamese were, some 60% of them had put for sale signs on their boats. They were going to flee again. It wasn't until this, charismatic colonel from the South Vietnamese army who had himself just bought a fish house in this town of Seabrook that colonel, with the help of some lawyers, convinced the Vietnamese community to stand their ground and to fight back, not with weapons, but as you said at the top here, by putting their faith in the Constitution. And so, it's one of these things where they, amid great danger, and Louis Beam was no, cream puff. This guy always bragged about his kill count. He had a pretty long rap sheet of indictments, but the Vietnamese stood their ground and they sued the Klan and these white allies of the Klan in federal court, seeking an emergency injunction to basically stop the Klan from harassing them and guaranteeing their right to fish just like anyone else in this country. And it's hard to prove these things, but my sense is that if the Vietnamese had fled, if they had done what the Klan wanted, I think the Klan and Louis Beam certainly would have felt emboldened and empowered to replicate this campaign anywhere else in the country, in any other industry, in any other town. But as a result of the Vietnamese, standing up to them, that militia was disbanded. Louis Beam bolted from the state and camped out in the compound of the Aryan Nations in Idaho. And I think the white sympathizers of the Klan, eventually had to kind of grudgingly accept that it wasn't going to be as easy as just threatening these people that drive them out, that they had to kind of accept that the Vietnamese had the same rights that they did to fish there.
Let's use this, Kirk, as an opportunity to stop for a second to hear about our sponsor, which is Ritual. Gaps in the diet shouldn't be ignored. Over 97% of women aged 19 to 50 are not getting enough vitamin D from their diet, and 95% are not getting their recommended daily intake of key omega-3s. Ritual's Essential for Women 18 Plus multivitamin was formulated by exhaustive research to help fill nutrient gaps in the diets of women ages 18 plus. It is formulated with nutrients to help support brain health, bone health, blood health, and provide antioxidant support. They invested in a gold standard university-led clinical trial to prove the impact of Essential for Women 18 Plus multivitamin. Essential for Women 18 Plus was shown to increase vitamin D levels by 43% and omega-3 DHA levels by 41% in 12 weeks. Ritual has just released Synbiotic, a gut health supplement with clinically studied prebiotics, probiotics, and a postbiotic all in one minty capsule. Just one delayed release Synbiotic capsule per day supports your gut with all the quality and traceability you'd expect from Ritual. My wife, Lisa, and I were initially impressed with Ritual's successful clinical trials and decided to try Ritual's Essential for Women 18 plus. When Ritual for Men 50 plus became available, I began to take Ritual every day. It's been over 3 years now, and even longer for Lisa, and we both continue to feel a significant difference every day. Right now, Ritual is offering my listeners 10% off your first 3 months. Visit ritual.com/murder and turn healthy habits into a ritual. That's 10% off at ritual.com/murder. Now, Kirk, we were talking about the situation in Seadrift and along this entire coast, anticipating the involvement of Louis Beam and the Klan. So tell us about the rise of Eugene Fisher And tell us about this person named Stanfield, which was a Klan organizer. Tell us about some of these characters that come forward to fight the Vietnamese.
So Gene Fisher at one point starts dating the widow of Billy Joe Applin. He was a Marine, fought in Vietnam, but when he came back, his life kind of hit the skids. He had multiple arrests for larceny, and he assaulted a cop at one point, went to prison. And when he got out, he was doing odd jobs like as a contractor and installing swimming pools, but he started trying his luck at shrimping. He was not a good shrimper. One of the longest running shrimpers in Galveston Bay told me that, he couldn't catch shrimp in a barrel. He wasn't a hard worker. He viewed the bay as like an ATM. He'd go out, make a withdrawal of some shrimp for a couple hours, and then convert that into booze at one of the local bars. But Gene Fisher, he liked attention. He saw all of the kind of attraction by the media to this issue after the killing of Billy Joe, and very quickly started stirring things up in Galveston Bay. He formed what was called the American Fishermen's Association, and he was always there to give a quote to journalists about the scourge of the Vietnamese and how it's a problem that needs to be solved. And, he talked about how there were too many Vietnamese boats and that someone needed to burn them and all of this. And he wasn't alone. He had allies. There were the two brothers, Jody and David Collins, that were shrimpers that signed on as officers to this American Fishermen's Association. And then there was also the main boat mechanic in town, a guy by the name of Jim Stanfield, who was making a killing off of repairing the engines of Vietnamese boats that, a lot of the whites sold them these boats that were the engine kicked out the next day, and so right. Stanfield was making a lot of money off the Vietnamese, but at the same time, none of them knew that he was the local recruiter for the Klan. So this is sort of the cast of characters that are doing everything they can to whip up these tensions. And in response, there was this colonel that I mentioned, Nam Van Nguyen, who, he's kind of thrust to the front of his community because of his decades of combat experience and leadership. And so he forms the Vietnamese Fishermen's Association. And so he's trying to reason with the whites and to find ways to keep the peace. And Gene and Nam were both brought into a hotel room by a Justice Department mediator trying to, force them. He locked them in there and said, you can't come out until you agree to something that's going to keep the peace. And they did. Nam agreed on his side to try to limit the number of new Vietnamese that were entering the industry. Of course, anyone has any right to go. There's nothing binding here. But Nam was openly discouraging Vietnamese from entering shrimping. He was pleading in the press with white people to stop selling boats to Vietnamese. He was doing what he could until 6 months later, some Vietnamese shrimpers from Louisiana come over. They don't know anything about what's going on or this agreement, and they start building a boat. And this just sets Gene Fisher off. And within 2 weeks of that, the boats in Galveston Bay started burning. And then Gene went to Louis Beam's headquarters and invited the Klan into the fray.
You talk about this Klan rally, the Valentine's Day Klan rally at the Collins residence at their property. Tell us about this rally and its effect.
Yeah, it was gasoline on the fire, quite literally. I think at that rally, there were something like 700 or 800 people, tons of press, lots of law enforcement at the perimeter, and hundreds of shrimpers and Klansmen. There were kids waltzing about in junior Klan robes. And it was a big old airing of grievances where, Gene threatened, he said, I'm going to be fishing in Galveston Bay, even if I have to run over every Vietnamese person. And he used a slur instead of what I'm saying, even if I have to run them over in my way. But all of that was a buildup to the arrival of Louis Beam, who could give a real fire and brimstone speech. And he did. Talked all about how these Vietnamese are your replacements and that the government brought them there to drive you out of this industry. Spoke of conspiracy, talked about the evils of immigration. And that's where he gave this 90-day deadline for the Vietnamese to flee. And he kept that threat off by setting fire to this boat that had the words USS Viet Cong painted on the side. It's just as a side note, it's like decades later, one of the things that infuriated the Vietnamese more than anything was this accusation that the white fishermen would make that they themselves were communists. These Vietnamese were refugees because they fought for decades against the Viet Cong and against the North. So, they were almost angrier at that allegation than anything else that happened. But so he sets fire to that boat. They burn a cross. Everyone gathers around and they chant the oath of the Texas Klan, which is Texas first, America first. We will fight. And from there, it just spirals out of control. Boats are torched. Vietnamese and other boats are destroyed where they, steal the CB equipment and steal the nets. There's talk of another big Klan rally. The Klan boat patrol happened. Colonel Nam's home was shot at. The whole Klan boat patrol culminated in they were there to threaten Nam above all else because they thought that if they could scare this colonel away, then maybe they could finally win. Nam wasn't home at the time, but his niece was babysitting his newborn daughter, and she looked out the kitchen window out at the dock behind and saw this, terrifying sight of a trawler filled with Klansmen and what looked like a body hanging off the side. So she bolted out to the street with the baby. This was this was not just fun and games or a lot of the white people that participated in all this. Now in interviews 40 years later, they always said, oh, you're blowing it out of proportion. Like we weren't really going to hurt anyone. And this was never about race. It was always about economics. And yet, they're rolling around with Klansmen cheering white power. So it's a little hard to take that at face value.
Tell us about Morris Dees and somebody that idolized him, Attorney Berg.
Morris Dees is a interesting guy. He himself, he's born outside of Montgomery, Alabama. He had plenty of Klansmen in his extended family. And he grew up in, near poverty with this burning ambition to get rich. And so, he's born in the 30s. He's coming of age as the civil rights movement is literally being born in the streets around him. His first day at University of Alabama, was a historic day where Autherine Lucy was the first Black student admitted to the school, and he watched as mobs threw bricks and eggs at this woman. But all along the way, even though he ended up getting a law degree, he just sat out the civil rights movement, just focused on getting rich. And he got quite rich. By the time he was 30, he was a multimillionaire, selling cookbooks and all kinds of stuff. But once he sells his company, he announces that he's going to retire to the practice of law. And it's then that he maybe some kind of penance or realization that he needs to do something more than just make money. That's when he starts the Southern Poverty Law Center. And in the beginning, they took on a number of really tough cases, like representing a Black woman that killed her jailer when he was trying to rape her. They sued the state government to integrate the state police force. They were trying to get at some of the more systematic problems of racism and poverty in America. And one of those was by taking on the Ku Klux Klan. And so he was getting breakfast one morning when he opened up the New York Times and sees a photo of that Klan boat patrol menacing Vietnamese refugees. And he hops on his motorcycle and heads down to Galveston Bay, where he finds Colonel Nam and with David Berg, who's another extraordinary person in this book and won his first case before the Supreme Court, I think as a 27-year-old. Morris Dees and David Berg represented these Vietnamese in their suit against the Klan amid great personal danger. I mean, the lawyers were getting death threats. There were guns brought to depositions. There were Klansmen outside their homes wedging calling cards and threats into their front door. But, they ultimately, none of this would have happened were it not for the Vietnamese being willing to take the true risk here and stay and fight.
What happens with that fight next?
They sue the Klan. It's kind of like punching a hornet's nest in a way, but they bring a very persuasive case before the federal judge. And over the course of a kind of shocking set of depositions and hearings, I mean, I get into a lot of it in the book where, they weren't even certain if they were going to survive some of these depositions. Ultimately, the judge enjoins the Klan and forbids them and people like Gene Fisher and the Collins brothers from harassing the Vietnamese, and solidly confirm that the Vietnamese are not doing anything wrong, that they have every right to shrimp there. And if you do more of these Klan boat patrols, we're going to lock you up. If you march near the Vietnamese in town in your Klan robes, we're going to throw the book at you. So in some ways, it's a very inspiring story. But from there, it really, in some ways, I think about it like when you zoom out from that courtroom, when that decision is handed down, and you see what happened in the coming years, where these bays just got more and more poisoned, where this coastline was basically, became known as the cancer belt, where big industry just went untrammeled, where now it's like decades later, like nobody's shrimping in these bays anymore. Doesn't matter if you're white or Vietnamese. There's not much to be caught. I mean, some of them, one of the shrimpers, Jody Collins, still alive when I was investigating this, and he told me there's certain parts on the coastline where he has to, tie a bandana over his nostrils because the stench from the chemicals is so strong. He's like, but there's a good shrimp catch in there, but he would never eat any of them himself.
Right.
This is kind of a dead industry at this point. And so, the whites debased themselves in this kind of racist campaign against the Vietnamese. They thought to kind of protect their own turf without paying attention to the fact that turf was being destroyed by people far more powerful than some Vietnamese refugees.
You introduce a character in this that ties this whole story together when we talked about the deformed crabs and other seafood. Diane Wilson is sort of an Aaron Brockovich character in fighting against these big corporations. She's not well educated. She's not well connected, not a lot of money, but she has a big interest and a dedication to this. And so Diane Wilson emerges as the person that shows all of these white fishermen and the Vietnamese themselves about the true reason why shrimping and crabbing and everything in this area is not very good at all and affects their personal economies. So tell us about Diane Wilson and what she endeavors to do.
Yeah, I think this would have been a radically different book if I had not met Diane and understood her story. Because, as you mentioned earlier, she's a fourth generation shrimper, but she was the first female shrimper, as best I know, on this coastline. It's not lost on me that the one woman in this book was the only one that could really clearly diagnose the threat in the landscape here, but no one was listening to her. No one was paying any attention. And not only that, once she started trying to organize and trying to take on the petrochemical industry in the way a woman making, a mother of five in a podunk little Texas town, making, $5,000 a year or something, you wouldn't think that that's the best candidate for taking on Exxon or Formosa or these other companies. But, in some ways, there's nothing more powerful than a pissed off mom. And she kept saying, she lived through all of this. She was there that night that Billy Joe was killed. She saw her fellow fishermen kind of disfigured by this racist, backlash. She kept saying, they're not the problem. These Vietnamese aren't the problem. It's the plants. She kept trying to draw their attention to the coastline. And she set off on a 30-year, still going battle against big industry that took almost everything from her. Her marriage fell apart. Her relationship with their kids was strained because of her commitment to this cause and what it took from them. Her home was shot at. Her dog was shot. Her boat was sabotaged, the hopes that she would drown out in one of the bays. She did several month-long hunger strikes, doing damage to her body. At one point, she was pushed to the brink and almost took her own life. She became a pariah in town. Her own extended family wouldn't talk to her. But over the decades, she just kept going. She kept accumulating evidence. She kept storing mutated specimens. She kept logging where she was picking up, finding, plastic that was dumped into the bay. And just 2 years or so ago, she won the largest ever settlement in U.S. history under the Clean Water Act from Formosa, which was a serial offender and polluter on the coast there. Everyone in town now thinks that she's a multimillionaire. I think it was $50 or $60 million that she won. But I can assure you that she lives off of $425 a month from Social Security. She's 74 years old. And she's using that money to try to revitalize this dying off industry by rebuilding some of the infrastructure, like new fish houses and ice houses, but also organizing both the white and Vietnamese shrimpers into a co-op so that they're not competing against each other and driving the value of their catch down every day. She's working to clean the bays up. She just got arrested not that long ago for what I guess is probably her 30th time that she's been arrested. This is an extraordinary woman that I think all of us could take a page from, or maybe if our spines were as strong as Diane, I think the world would be a better place. But in some ways, I think this story was always that there were a group of people who felt that the world was changing too quickly. And they looked at their bank accounts and saw it declining. They looked at the future and they weren't very optimistic. They looked at their kids and didn't think that their kids were going to follow them into the industry, their way of life. And this was all happening because of the march of mankind, which isn't pretty and it's not always positive or forward or progressive. It was destroying these bays in exchange for some short-term jobs. And in the midst of all of that, they looked around and they found that because they were whipped up by a demagogue and ready to be whipped up by a demagogue, they pointed this finger at the weakest people around them and they said, let's get rid of them and everything will be great again. And so Diane is the one kind of corrective to all of this. She's the one that said, no, it wasn't them. It never was. You brought shame to your name by doing all of this. You should have joined me in this fight to really protect our bays against the true villain.
Let's use this as an opportunity to stop for a second for these messages. You talk about how Diane Wilson was never compromised. She did the valiant fight and achieved many of the things she thought were only a dream because of her limited background. But you also talk about Morris Dees and Clan Watch. And what he found was that in terms of raising money, that people against the Klan were very, very generous. How does this somewhat compromise Morris Dees?
Yeah, this was so fascinating because, I founded a nonprofit at one point in my life and, I was helping thousands of my Iraqi colleagues get out, those that were endangered because they worked alongside us during the war. And when I came to realize just how much money Morris Dees was raking in for the Southern Poverty Law Center, my initial instinct was, hey, good for them. Like I would have loved to have had more money so that I could have expanded my programs and achieved more because I was terrible at fundraising. But then digging deeper, over the subsequent decades, the Southern Poverty Law Center, I think rightfully, by 1994, there's a huge expose by the Montgomery Advertiser. But, it had become almost like an organization that existed to raise money so that it could raise more money. The tough work of cases like this, they weren't bringing that many cases anymore by the 90s and into the aughts. And yet in every mailing, Morris was whipping up this specter of the Ku Klux Klan and give everything you can now. And they were talking with, they had a whole team of estate lawyers working to get people to donate portions of their estate upon their death. But then it wasn't fueling some big army of lawyers protecting the poor and sort of the original charter. And so, I think, there's some quote near the end of the book, but where, I think it's something to the effect that, of all the things Morris is most proud of, it's his skill in advertising.
Yeah.
And so in some ways, I think the Southern Poverty Law Center, it's, he basically got thrown overboard a few years ago under allegations of impropriety towards a staffer. But it was also, it was a factor of that during the rise of the Trump administration. There was so much money going into the Southern Poverty Law Center to take on what they thought was rightfully, understood as this huge spike in white supremacist violence in America. It's just that the center, which had something like almost $500 million endowment, they were taking a lot of that money to then use fundraising services to raise more money. So Morris is no longer with the center. I think we're at this moment now where people want uncompromised and they want pure heroes and pure villains. And in this case, I think Morris is interesting to me in the sense that he has a real arc of ups and downs in his life. And he did something really extraordinary here with the help of other lawyers and employees of the Southern Poverty Law Center and mostly from the Vietnamese. And so, I think that's to be commended, but that doesn't mean that everything he does is saintly, if that makes any sense.
You also talk about the dangers of this, of concentrating on the Klan when the Klan, unlike the 80s or earlier, was on the rise. It was now in decline. So what of spending good money on something, whereas someone like Louis Beam and others were moving in a slightly different direction in terms of white supremacists?
Yeah, if you look at, a few years ago, I forgot who it was, someone with a show on CNN went and talked his way into a Klan rally, and it was like one of the most pathetic scenes you could imagine. It's just like some 4 or 5 gangly 20-year-olds sitting on folding chairs talking wistfully about the glory days or whatever.
Yeah.
The truth is that so much of the ideology that animated the Klan back then and all of their white allies on this Texas coast, frankly, has become mainstreamed and a big segment of the Republican base at this point. You turn on Fox News and watch Tucker Carlson speak about the Great Replacement and of the dangers of immigration and what it's doing, taking jobs away from white people. It's virtually indistinguishable from what Louis Beam was saying at these Klan rallies. We had at Charlottesville a bunch of college kids marching with the torches saying that, Jews will not replace us.
Yeah.
All this talk about the wall that Trump was kind of duping his followers into funding. I was reading the literature of the white supremacist movement from the early 80s, and you open these publications up and they're ranting about Vietnamese shrimpers on one side, and on the other side, they're laying out schematics for the American wall and how to electrify it and where would you build the boat to keep people out of the border. Louis Beam's militia was doing border patrols to try to capture people crossing the border. So this is, we had a big refugee ban under the Trump administration. So the themes of the book are, and the kind of disfiguring ideology that causes, people like Jody Collins and his brother, who to their dying days denied that they were Klansmen and were offended at the suggestion that they would be Klansmen. And yet they hosted a rally with 1,000 Klansmen. They let the Klan borrow their boats for patrols. There's something endlessly horrifying to me at how easily that switch seems to be flipped in the minds of people who think that somebody who looks different from them is there to take something away from them, and how easily that can be kind of morphed into violent action.
Yes. It's incredible too. We couldn't really describe, or I didn't really have an opportunity to describe all the vivid scenes that you have, including Diane Wilson's attempt to foment change where she went on a hunger strike, but also very vivid scenes of a black judge ruling on having Klansmen wear their robes in a court proceeding. Incredible. Fascinating.
Yeah. Honestly, there were many kind of breathtaking moments in the act of investigating this story, not just from uncovering details like that, but also just from finally getting the people at the heart of this story to open up and talk to me and what they revealed in the process.
What is the situation in terms of shrimping in that area now? Not surprising.
The truth is there's not that much going on. And, there's 2 kinds of shrimping. There's bay shrimping where you can go out for a few hours and, drag the bays and see what you get. And then there's the much more intensive Gulf fishing when these are the boats that go out for a month at a time. And for a long time, those crews of the Gulf boats were predominantly Mexican and Guatemalan workers on H-2B visas, these short-term skilled worker programs. So they would come in for 6 months or so, or, however long the season was, do the hard work and then go home. And the Trump administration really throttled that program. And I guess their thinking was that if they block Mexicans and Guatemalans from taking those jobs, then we've opened them back up for white people. But it turns out that white people don't want to go spend a month in rough, cramped conditions on a shrimp boat in the Gulf. And so those boats are largely just tied up now on docks up and down the Texas coast. They're unmanned. And so, that's a story that, you point to any industry and you'll find a similar story playing out. And so no, there's not a thriving fishing industry in Texas anymore.
And what about Louis Beam?
Well, he's still alive. For a couple decades, he's been claiming that he's dying of Agent Orange. I don't make light of that. My dad passed away of cancer spurred by Agent Orange during his own deployment. But he's still around. He's in Texas. But he has publicly kind of removed himself from the front lines. But he's now considered the godfather of the alt-right and a kind of hero to many who are pursuing a kind of white supremacist ideology today.
Interesting. And also Eugene Fisher and I think Stanfield, the boat mechanic, went up in terms of the hierarchy of the Klan.
That's right.
After Louis Beam. So very, very interesting. I want to thank you so much, Kirk Wallace Johnson, for coming on and talking about The Fisherman and the Dragon, Fear, Greed, and a Fight for Justice on the Gulf Coast. Could you tell us when this book will be released and when it's to be released, and any information on how to contact you or find out more about this book?
As we speak, it has just come out. So it's the formal publication date was August 9th. So it should be in bookstores and online anywhere people can find it. And I'm on Twitter if people look me up, or my website, which is kirkwjohnson.com.
Oh, thank you so much. The Fisherman and the Dragon, Fear, Greed, and a Fight for Justice on the Gulf Coast. Thank you so much, Kirk Wallace Johnson.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Good night.